Welcome to Books of Change Author Talks, where we talk with authors whose books have the potential for changing the world for the better. Today, I have here with me Dr. Neil Dullaghan, the author of the recent book, The Compassion Mandate. Hi, Neil.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to chat.
Absolutely. And my name is Mikko Järvenpää. I am the executive director of Books of Change and Worldshapers. And we are quite excited to publish this book, all of the books that we publish, but this book especially, given its strong focus on the European Union's leadership and role in farmed animal welfare regulation and legislation, and also the timeliness of the book. And we'll be going into this with Neil in this chat. We'll cover the audience, the content, and the ambition of the book, and we'll finish with a recommendation from Neil for what are immediate next actions that somebody so moved can take after this. But yeah, Neil, you've worked on the research side of looking at policymaking and regulation, especially in the European Union context, for a while. Tell me how you came to the idea of writing this book, and who is it especially targeted for?
Right, yeah, I've been studying European Union political scientists for over a decade, and what really stood out to me was the glaring absence of any real work on the issue of animal welfare, in particular farmed animal welfare, especially in light of how many protections for farmed animals the EU historically had actually offered. So it seemed to me quite glaring that there was no real study on the topic. It seemed like there would be a gap to fill, especially in light of a lot of public demand for greater action from the European Union from the previous Commission in the sort of 2019 to 2024 period. So it seemed like it was very topical and a gap that needed filling. And in my mind, who the book is for primarily is Europhiles, people who really believe in the project of European integration and to see animal welfare as an area for leadership in this area, especially among young professionals, policy professionals. Secondly, I think civil society and citizens could really benefit from reading the Compassion Mandate as an area for action. But if they really care about animal welfare as much as they say they do in opinion polls, that they could be more mobilized on this issue and really make sure that their representatives know. And then thirdly, this area for research from political scientists and scholars, where there's actually a rich amount of data that they could pull from to test their theories and generate a lot more insights.
Yeah, that's great. I think the one thing that is striking is how there certainly has been a gap in the literature and even in the field to an extent, which is even more striking given how strongly the European Union is a union around agriculture and trade, and how strong its roots are in coordinating the member states' agricultural production and efforts. Um, at the same time, the European Union has even a commissioner focused on animal welfare. Yet there seems to be this significant gap, perhaps even a mismatch of priorities. Um, how do you think that's come about historically?
Yeah, so certainly there's a gap. You can even see it on very specific policy issues where something like 89% of Europeans say they want to see farmed animals in the EU out of cages and have signed a European Citizens Initiative, which is a non-binding petition asking the European Commission exactly to do that, to mandate an end to the use of cages. And yet you have not seen sort of repeated opportunities for the European institutions to act on this taken up. And I think that primary reasons for that are like an ongoing issue in the European Union's multi-level governance system of a sort of democratic deficit critique, where you have these institutions that are not directly elected by citizens, often felt to be too bureaucratic. And the EU has attempted to mitigate this through various means over the decades, increasing the powers of the European Parliament, trialing initiatives like Spitzencandidate or European Citizens Initiatives, but none of these have really offered the strong link between citizens and these institutions that enables it to be a truly representative body. I think a second element is that while many people care about the issue of animal welfare, they're not organized in issue publics into voting blocks.
Sure.
And in contrast, the sort of those who would not like to see any action on this area are very organized and very powerful and are an issue public and have a lot more access already to the institutions from decades of somewhat regulatory capture. And then the last part is more reasonable in my mind, that from a technocratic point of view, animal welfare is not a core competency of the European Union. It's viewed under the lens of food safety or consumer information. And so it shouldn't be maybe surprising that civil servants don't prioritize this issue, as it's not a standalone issue, despite having now the welcome change that the commissioner has animal welfare in their title. They've not actually been allocated more resources to deal with that issue.
One thing that I think you do very well in your book is you make the ideas and what animal welfare, farmed animal welfare actually means in practice, you make that more concrete. What are some of the things that you, in your book, pay attention to as potential improvements, and what are things that you think are part of the menu of policy changes and legislation that should be seriously considered next?
So the compassion mandate is supposed to be a very pragmatic, realistic look at the political landscape. And so I focus a lot on issues that I think have a real chance of being advanced forward and offer great improvements for animals, and also offer European leaders the opportunity to reclaim some moral high ground and regain some momentum in this area. And so candidates for those types of changes to me seem like ending extreme confinement of egg-laying hens currently kept or allowed to be kept in these so-called enriched cages, where they have the space per hen of maybe an iPad with access to some minimal enrichment materials. And on that issue, you've seen the market already moving the direction of getting rid of cages. Now over 60% of hens raised in the EU are already out of cages. You've seen sort of a handful of European Union member states already agree to ban cages in their own countries. The Eurobarometer surveys show that the public is behind this issue. As I said, 89% of Europeans thinking we should end cages. And you've also seen the European Citizens Initiative showing that at least some number of people are willing to be mobilized to act on this issue. And the Commission has already done a lot of the preparatory work to actually phase this out, because they had a previous reform package that eventually was shelved, but they've already done a lot of the regulatory background work. And finally, you have the European Union's own Animal Welfare Science Committee, EFSA, making the specific recommendation to end these cages. So this one seems like a sort of no-brainer as an easy win, both for politicians, for representatives, and for animal welfare. And then two other issues that really stand out to me are, one, making sure that the existing standards that the EU already has apply to imports to protect domestic farmers and to make sure that the market is not flooded with these cheaper but much lower welfare imports and undermine all the progress that's been made. And on a more optimistic side, could even lead to other exporting nations outside of the EU adopting the same standards to get access to the market. This would be a classic case of the Brussels effect, where the EU's regulatory standards are effectively exported abroad, and that would increase the number of animals that are helped by these measures. And finally, over the next decade, I would recommend that an area for focus would be on farmed fish that have been historically neglected by the European Union, despite being very large in scale. Approximately 1 billion fish are farmed in EU countries every year, including 45% of the sea bass and sea bream farmed in the world, and where there's been very little protections, in fact, sometimes even excluded from some of the directives or laws like the slaughter regulation. And in cases where they are at least implicitly included, the language of the laws doesn't suit them. For example, in the transport regulation, the language talks about enough space for them to walk around, which is clearly
Right.
absurd for farm fish. So these seem like areas where there's a lot of farmed animals. There are pretty easy wins for both politicians, for the public, for animals. And there's already been at least some legwork done in some of these areas, either by member states or by the European Union itself.
Thank you. Yeah, those are exactly the kinds of examples of the pragmatic and practical aspects of animal welfare that make it more tractable, really, for people. You mentioned trade. You mentioned the Brussels effect. If we, assuming that we accept the idea that billions of animals, deserve better treatment. Um, do you think the European Union as a trade bloc has a unique leverage in its ability to export its regulations? And are there other kind of economic or international trade levers that the union should be considering?
Yeah, I certainly think so. That the European Union is the strongest trading bloc in the world, and you see in other issues unrelated to animal welfare, this sort of Brussels effect taking effect. It's sort of regulatory around very small, like pharmaceutical and technical goods. So there's like precedent that this can happen. You also hear like anecdotal evidence that even the fairly weak sort of slaughter standards that are set around broiler chickens, for example, are copied by slaughterhouses in China for poultry there. So there's some latent evidence that like this can happen. And you already have existing trade deals that the European Union has negotiated with other countries that include animal welfare chapters. Chile and New Zealand are two examples that I can pull from where they have some standards around meeting EU minimums, particularly around egg-laying hens. In practice, there's some limits about how many sort of shell eggs are actually imported and exported between these countries and how many animals they'll affect. But there's some precedent that there's willingness to do something on this. And then on transport as well, you see similar issues where the EU could simply enact stricter licensing agreements to make it harder for animals to be transported to places that won't respect the same standards that are required in the EU. And then I think there's this element of soft power that the EU is supposed to be very powerful at, that without sort of these stricter regulatory measures, simply setting the norm of what's possible and what's accepted by sort of, civilized democratic societies, that other countries that want to emulate the EU will enact those even without any particular costs associated with them from any measures the EU has taken.
Yeah, yeah. How do you feel about the current new normal, although I hesitate to call it that, of international trade, where tariffs are on the table, and protectionism, perhaps even a level of isolationism, is kind of rearing its head. The idea of protecting the single market, for instance, from low welfare, but also, of course, low cost imports. Is this a time where those the trade levers are more powerful, or do you think that this might be a temporary situation?
Yeah, the current climate certainly feels like it's putting this idea of trade protectionism back on the agenda and making it very salient. But I think we should clear that this is not anything new to the EU. It has a long history of protecting its agricultural production domestically and requiring certain standards for those products that are imported to protect their domestic farmers, just not with an eye towards animal welfare. So this is something they have a long history of doing. It's more just, perhaps now it's more in vogue to be able to say that more explicitly and not hide under some other language about simply not meeting food safety standards. But now you can be more outright in saying this is to protect domestic farmers and the domestic market, and maybe this creates more of a window of opportunity to bring forward these standards more nakedly in the actual interests that they're trying to serve. There can certainly be backfiring effects for sure. If there's not sufficient supply created domestically of the higher welfare products that people want, or just the commodity products that people want. And this could lead to actually a backlash against the existing laws and watering down, perhaps. So it has to be something that you have to be done with some caution. But it's something that can be done. There's certainly a window of opportunity. And I think as a strong trading bloc in the international system, the EU is well placed to be able to do that. And to the extent sometimes people raise concerns around what cases might be brought to the World Trade Organization,
Right.
I think these are sometimes often overblown, and much of this is about political will, and that the EU has already won cases around the trade of seal fur products, exactly on the merits of public outrage about that issue,
Right.
and banned those sort of imports. And so I think it's really about political will here.
That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. What do you hope for the book and the ideas it represents to do? Like, what's your ambition for this for the project, for the book, the Compassion Mandate, but also for the project that the book represents?
So first and foremost would be to help the animals that the book sheds light on their suffering. The EU farms into animal products approximately 7 billion terrestrial vertebrate animals every
Yeah.
year, and then on top of that, farms sort of a few 100 million egg-laying hens and dairy cows, and then the billion fish that I mentioned before. So enacting these standards hopefully would improve their lives, and that's the ultimate aim of the Compassion Mandate. Beyond that, I'm hoping that it reinvigorates people towards thinking about EU leadership in a different way, thinking about animal welfare in a different way, that they sort of join the two and see those as interlinked opportunities. And with that in mind, the various different audiences for the book, I hope, can take different actions. So for the young policy professionals who might see this as sort of an interesting policy puzzle and an opportunity, they can advance this in their careers and trying to find legislative solutions for these farmed animal welfare problems and advance that in the policy agenda space. For the citizens, I think that they can contact their members of the European Parliament and ask them to be vocal and active on this issue. And similarly for their members of national parliament, to make sure that when their government's positions are represented in Brussels through the permanent representatives, to make sure that animal welfare is top of the agenda.
That's a lot, but at the same time, it feels tractable, again, to use that word. Like, that is, there are things that we can do. If we care about these things, we can actually do these things. What would be like one recommendation that you'd give, like, somebody right after this listening to this chat can take to advance these ideas?
I think it would be pick up your copy of the Compassion Mandate and look up your member of the European Parliament in whatever country you happen to reside in, and send them an email or a handwritten letter telling them that this is an issue that you care about, that you're watching what they do on it, and that you intend to be more active on it. And you want to see an end to cages for egg-laying hens. You want to see imports meet the same standards that the EU sets, and you want to see more action in the space of farmed fish welfare.
I will act on that myself. Thank you so much, Neil. This has been a pleasure talking to you, and congratulations on the book.